We'd read in last week's Parsha how Yaakov had taken the birthright, which was rightfully his, and it was under the instruction of his mother. And Esav had vowed to kill Yaakov for what he had done. And how did Rivka know this? It was communicated to her through divine communication, because Esav, being who he was, it was impossible to know his intention. Therefore, Hashem had revealed it to Rivka that Esav is harboring this hate in his heart and just waiting for the moment to kill Yaakov. He's instructed by his mother, he must flee to the home of a brother. But of course, Rivka does not share this with Yitzchak. And she says to Yitzchak, her husband, I'm disgusted with the daughters of Ches, because these are the women who Esav had married. They were idolaters. And it's not worth living if my son Yaakov takes such a wife. Therefore, I suggest he should go to my brother Lavan and take a wife from there. So Yitzchak summons Yaakov, instructs him that he should go to Aram Naharaim, to Choron, to marry one of the daughters of Lavan. That's the story. So he flees. But in interim, which the Torah doesn't reveal, was just through a calculation, age-wise, Yaakov had spent 14 years in Shem Ve'ever, studying Torah. He had taken the blessings at the age of 63. He spent 14 years in Shem Ve'ever, and then afterwards, he went to Choron. Those 14 years were not held against him. Although his mother had said, you will go liyomim achodim, for a short period of time, and he overstayed his time there, and he was held accountable for it. And that's why Yosef was actually, he believed he was not alive for 22 years, but those 14 years were not held against him. So Rashi cites the Midrash is b'schus HaTorah. In the merit of Torah, therefore, it was not held against him. So we discussed Yaakov his whole life. The Torah depicts him as a personification of Torah. Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim. He spent his whole life until the age of 63 studying Torah. Now that he has to flee, now he has to spend another 14 years studying Torah, and there's no end to it. Why now does he take this time out before he goes to Choron, to Lavan, to study an additional 14 years in Shem Ve'ever? The question, we discussed this in the past. David is on the Zoom today. We have to say Shechianu or Mechayim Mason. We haven't seen him in a while. Good morning, David. Okay. Ernie said he's checking out early this morning, so you're going to fill in for him. Okay. So we had explained in the past that Yaakov never believed that he'd have to leave the confines of Eretz Yisrael. As we had said, Yitzchak was not permitted to leave the land because Yitzchak was an Ola Tmima. He was an unblemished offering. Leaving Eretz Yisrael would be taking a korban and taking it out of the confines of the sanctuary, which would invalidate the korban. Yaakov believed that he would always remain in Eretz Yisrael. Being the most special of the avos, of the patriarchs, so whatever Torah he'd learned to deal with all the issues, what Choron represents, all the counter forces to Kedusha, those forces he wasn't prepared to deal with. Shem and Aver, Shem, who had experienced the great flood and lived pre-flood, and Aver being his son, they knew exactly how to contend with all those evil forces. So he had to spend another 14 years now preparing for this new challenge, which he never prepared for, and that's why he spent 14 years studying this additional Torah. So when he goes to Choron, he should have this level of protection and clarity that he should not be compromised because of the environment of Lavan. This is the way we explained it in the past. So therefore, those 14 years were not a breach of the Yom HaChodim. But his mother had said, go for a short period of time. So now the Torah tells us, Vayetzi Yaakov Beersheva. Yaakov left Beersheva. Vayelech Chorono. And he went to Choron. So of course, the obvious question is, we know that Yaakov was in Beersheva, so we don't have to, Torah doesn't have to tell us that he left Beersheva. Where he's going, Torah has to tell us where he's going. It should say, Vayelech Yaakov Chorono. Why is it important for the Torah to tell us that he left Beersheva? If he's there, and it's obvious from the previous parsha that that was his location, it was Beersheva, because that's where his parents were. So the famous Rashi, Vayetze, the second Rashi, all the Torah should have said was Yaakov went to Choron. Also, why does it mention his leaving, his exit from Beersheva? Then when a tzaddik leaves a location, it leaves its mark. There is a void created, a vacuum created when the tzaddik leaves the location. When a tzaddik is in a city, hu hodo, hu zivo, hu adoro. He's its splendor, he's its radiance, and its beauty. Yotzim mishom, pono hodo, pono zivo, pono hadoro. When he leaves, all that leaves with him, whatever he represented. Nomi and Rus, they were in Sdei Moav. When they left, Torah says they left Sdei Moav to go back to Eretz Yisrael. They were there. What does it have to tell us in Rus that they left? Because the only representation of Kedusha that existed in Sdei Moav was Nomi and Rus. So when they left a void of spirituality. So Yetzi Yaakov Beersheva, when the tzaddik leaves the location, there is a very significant diminishment of that location. So over here, it's telling me something very interesting. Although Yitzchak and Rivka were there at the time, his parents were alive, and Yitzchak was the Av. At this moment, he was the patriarch, and his mother was the Aim, the matriarch. Nevertheless, Yaakov's value was so great that his leaving the location actually created, at a certain level, a void of that spirituality. His his representation was no longer there. See, what I would have said initially to explain this, that since Yaakov represented something differently than his father, because Yaakov was Midas HaRachmim, so therefore he's Tiferes, Midas HaRachmim, so what was left behind was Gvura, which was Yitzchak. So his level of representation, and because what he represented in terms of Hashem's, he emulated that characteristic of Hashem, therefore that representation was no longer there, therefore that void was created. So although his parents were there, but his representation was no longer there, therefore it's Vayetze. The location was compromised because of that. And maybe that's what we'll say, because it says, as we find by Nomi and Rus, when they left, also it says they left the location. Of course, but there was nothing. When they're there with their everything, so when they leave, there's nothing left behind. It's a total spiritual vacuum. Here, although there was Yitzchak and Rivka, but since the representation of Hashem's presence was a different level of representation, what he represented was no longer there. Therefore, Hashem's relevance to the location was no longer that same relevance. That's the understanding. But the objective was to go to Choron. So the Torah's only telling us in passing. He left Beersheva just to give us this understanding. But why is he leaving? He's leaving to go to Choron. Though it's known, the Chazon Ish left Europe after the Chofetz Chaim passed away. The Chazon Ish held that as long as the Chofetz Chaim was alive, Europe had the status of Eretz Yisrael, had a special shmirah. The moment Chofetz Chaim is no longer there, he's out of there. That's to the degree that the Chazon Ish understood the value of the Chofetz Chaim. The way Hashem, and somebody had explained it with a moshel, with an allegory. They said, if you looked at the map of Europe and you would see Berlin, there was a big, large black circle and in bold letters it said Berlin. If you look at Paris, there was a large, in bold letters, Paris, with a round black circle. London, if you want to look for Radin, which was the Chofetz Chaim's community, which was a little village where the streets weren't even paved, you'd have to take a magnifying glass to be able to find Radin on the map. So he says that's the global map. That's on the terrestrial level. On the heavenly level, Hashem's map, you take a look at the map, Radin takes up 98% of the map. Paris, Berlin, London, you barely can notice it on the map. So Hashem's map is a different map than the human map. So Chazon Ish understood, once the Chofetz Chaim is no longer alive, it's Yotze Hoda, Ziva, and Hadora. Everything, it became, even though there were Gedolim left behind, nevertheless, but it's interesting, the Nazis, Yimach Shemam Zichrom, there's a famous picture where they're marching into Vilna at the time of the funeral of Reb Chaim Moser, Brzezinski, who was the leading Torah sage at that time. That month, that Elul, 3 Gedolim passed away. This gives you a little Jewish history. Reb Chaim Moser passed away. Reb Baruch Ber Libutz, Zechat Tzarech Livrocha, the Kabbalah Shiv passed away, and Reb Shimon Shkop passed away. 3 of the leading Torah sages, the greatest of that generation, passed away that month. After they passed away, Hitler, Yimach Shemo, they enter into Vilna to take over Lithuania, to take over Latvia, all those countries. As long as they were there, their representation, their location had a shmirah because they were there. Once they pass on, there's that breach in the wall, they enter. We're vulnerable, unfortunately, to the attack of Amalek. That was when they entered. So when they left this world, it was Vayetze. The world there was a spiritual void. And as a result of that, they were able to come in and bring about what they brought about.